Isaiah chapter 1, verses 5 and 6. Let's just we'll read from verse 1 just to walk back into this quick. The vision concerning Judah and Jerusalem that Isaiah son of Amos saw during the reign of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Hear, O heavens, listen, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. I reared children and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me. The ox knows his master, the donkey his owner's manger, but Israel does not know, my people do not understand. Ah, sinful nation, a people loaded with guilt, a brood of evildoers, children given to corruption. They have forsaken the Lord, they have spurned the Holy One of Israel and turned their backs on him. And now the section regarding our question here. Why should you be beaten anymore? Why do you persist in rebellion? Your whole head is injured, your whole heart afflicted, from the sole of your foot to the top of your head. There's no soundness, only wounds and welts and open sores, not cleansed or bandaged or soothed with oil. So this question just wants us to think a moment about, to whom is Isaiah directing his message here? So he talks kind of in third person about Israel at first. Like you would talk about someone not present. But now he makes it more personal. He talks second person. I don't know how you feel when I preach this way. We were taught to avoid it, I think, early on. I've found that I have to be somewhat judicious with it. But generally as a minister, maybe you want to include yourself in there, so there's we and us. But sometimes I also make it you. And the danger with that is, especially in law preaching, you might get the idea that I'm saying you, but not me, right? But sometimes to hear it spoken to us that way helps to more personalize it. I think the gospel, if I preach the gospel of you, God loves you, then that doesn't come across as bad. You figure I'm probably including myself too. But if I'm preaching the law, and I've got that prophet's finger out there, then that doesn't come across quite so nicely. But here, Isaiah goes from talking about Israel in the third person, like he's talking about somebody else, to directly addressing them. Your head is injured, your heart afflicted. You or you're there. So he's talking to the people of Judah. And why is that a point just worth touching upon before we move past? What's it tell us about the message? What does it tell us about the preaching? What does it tell us about ourselves?
It just seems to me that it's saying, you've been corrected so many times, but you continue on and doing, sinful, being against God.
Yeah. I mean, how many years down the road are we from Moses? About 700. 700. I mean, take our country back 700 years. There's nobody but Native Americans, right?
That's Oxford and King of England. You go back to
Right. I mean, you're at like the Magna Carta,
right?
Yeah, right. You're King John and the Magna Carta in European history. You're pre-Reformation. You're kind of High Middle Ages. Maybe some Vikings have gotten here by 1200. I don't know. We don't know exactly when. Guys like Leif Erikson, so in all of that time, God sent one. You had the period of the judges. You had prophets sent, and so God's starting to lose patience. You can see He's a very patient God. And then I think the other thing is to understand. There's a perception out there sometimes that the Christian ministers are talking about the sins of society out there. And sometimes Christian ministers have probably been guilty of that. Sometimes Christian individuals become guilty of that. As much as we would like to see our neighbors treat each other better and do better, and we recognize that we have societal issues that should be resolved or worked on, right? As much as we recognize that, and Christians may even sometimes bond together to try to address some of those things, ostensibly for the good of their neighbor, but there is always some possibility of developing a pharisaical, better than thou sort of approach and attitude with that doesn't play well outside the church. So as much as there are societal ills, we have to recognize that the main preaching of the Christian church is to, when it comes to trying to correct inside. I could preach all day about the sins of society and make you guys feel really good about yourselves. And maybe you'd like that, I don't know, maybe not. Maybe we don't appreciate it when the preaching hits a nerve with ourselves, but that's how we grow. I think Martin Luther once said, nobody changes until they're offended. And first, when it first hits you, it's like, who's that man to tell me that? Or why should I have to listen to this? And you bristle, like you did with your parents at one point in time, right? If they corrected something, the first reaction to correction is not necessarily, oh, I'm sorry, I'll do better. Not in most cases. The first reaction is, wait a minute, who are you talking about here? And Isaiah's got to break through that for the people of Israel. And we as Christians, it's an acquired taste. It is an acquired taste to want to hear the law applied to you personally. It doesn't come naturally to any of us, but it is a necessary taste to develop. That we can take confrontation. That we recognize the Bible is not here just to tell me I'm good. I am not a motivational speaker who is here to build you up in how good you are already and what you can do. I am a preacher, a prophet who is here to help you grow spiritually by, it's more like a doctor and diagnosis, right? To help you see what's wrong and then to lead you to the antidote, to lead you to the solution. And of course, if I'm doing it right, I am walking there with you the whole way. But there is a place for some preaching and teaching that says not just we and us, and certainly isn't just talking about they and them out there, but talks about me and talks about you. And sometimes Isaiah doesn't do it so much. Jeremiah is much more personal. David in the Psalms is much more personal. There's a lot of I and me when you read David. There's a lot of I and me when you read Jeremiah. And I think sometimes if the preacher is demonstrating it that way with an I and a me kind of illustration, that's also helpful. You recognize I'm not excluding you then either, but I am then trying to be the living example. If Jesus used I and me, it was never the law part, it was only the gospel part. But your human preacher can certainly have I and me for both. Question 6, how would you describe the political condition of Judah at the time of Isaiah's ministry according to verse 7? Your country is desolate, your cities burned with fire, your fields are being stripped by foreigners right before you, laid waste as when overthrown by strangers.
They were on the defensive, getting crushed.
Yeah. Now Isaiah prophesies over the period of almost a half a century. And so there were times when Judah was seeming to do pretty well. It's interesting that the northern kingdom, which fell to the Assyrians about 722, actually had some good administrative rulers leading up to that and seemed to be fairly prosperous. And then you read the prophets of that time, and they're taking the people on in the north because the prosperity has gone to their heads. And Isaiah has to do that sometimes too. So some of what you see in Isaiah, it sounds like things are really well. But, and here again, when we look at his book, we don't assume that everything is coming in chronological order. This sounds like the kind of thing he could have been writing at the time when the Assyrians had come into Judah also and had conquered many of their cities and burned and salted many of their fields. And they are struggling as a nation that way. Part of, I think I brought this up last week with things like, changes in weather and climate, etc., things that we may see in terms of the economic situation in our country, wars around the world. On the one hand, we understand that that's just part of a broken, sinful world, right? On the other hand, we shouldn't discount that there is a chastening hand of God in that. Now, for God's people, it's never just mere punishment or justice, right? He's never going to get us back just because he's like angry. He's just going to hurt us. But if we take suffering from God as discipline, as chastisement, as His means to try to lead us to change. And whether we can draw a direct point-to-point line between some behavior and something that we suffer or not, we recognize that's always true, at least in a general way. And then to see that, well, okay, maybe at least we ought to pause to consider if things aren't going well for us as a nation or as individuals, whether we are under the suffering and chastening hand of God who's trying to discipline us and improve us. But it would appear here that Isaiah is pointing out, so the things you're going through as a country, Judah, at this point in time, you should see that as God's chastening. This is the hand of someone trying to discipline you and call you back. But they're kind of on the ropes. Page 2, backside there. Who is the dominant power in the world? This is kind of review, but who's the dominant power in the world at the time that Isaiah is prophesying?
He has several. I mean, it's the Babylonians or the Assyrians or
So the Assyrians.
which ones were?
So the Babylonians are going to be on the rise, but they've not become a world power just yet. So they visit during Hezekiah's kingship, right? We're going to read about that in chapter 39. But the Babylonians aren't the superpower yet. God knows, and Isaiah has had it revealed to him that they're going to be the next ones. But they aren't there yet. Assyria dominates. Egypt is still pretty strong, but Assyria dominates. And I don't think we talked about it in the opening. You know, Assyria they were scary people. Assyria kind of, if they didn't invent psychological warfare, they refined it. So when they killed soldiers on the battlefield, they would build towers of human bodies as a part of the way of intimidating the other side. Look how many people we were able to kill.
Towers of heads, if they don't like a village, they'll kill everybody there and chop. Well, anyway, it's pretty gory.
They were unmerciful. And they like to impale people alive, stick them up on poles. And of course, you didn't necessarily die right away. And somewhat akin to Roman crucifixion, probably worse in some ways. Drive that pole up through, starting from between a person's legs and up through their head.
But they did
or up to their neck. And then you didn't die necessarily right away. And then they would kind of hustle to try to get as many of those staked people out there as possible. Psychological warfare, and there were just no limits to their cruelty. I understand that the VeggieTales thing wants to be kind of funny, but they did the story of Jonah, and Jonah is sent to Nineveh, which is the Assyrian capital. And anybody know the crime of the Assyrians and Ninevites in the story of Jonah? And,
Fish slapping.
Fish slapping, yeah. They're taking fish and they're slapping people with fish.
Trying to make family entertainment.
So they're trying to make family entertainment. There's a sense of humor behind it, but it does not nearly do justice to the cruelty of the Assyrians. They were a tough people. And Judah had a right to be afraid of what they were possibly facing. The level of cruelty is almost unparalleled in the history of world empires. Isaiah had addressed the rebels. Where do we first hear of the existence of a faithful remnant? Well, okay, it's been a week since you read this. Look down to verses 8 and 9. The daughter of Zion is left like a shelter in a vineyard, like a hut in a field of melons, like a city under siege. So he's talking about the fact that these Assyrians have pressed in. They took your neighbors to the north. They've taken a lot of your own territory. They've got a foot in Egypt now. They pretty much have dominated everything, and you're just these little holdouts. Kind of all alone and isolated. But then he goes on. Unless the Lord Almighty had left us some survivors, we would have become like Sodom. Would have been like Gomorrah. Well, you know what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah, of course. God rains sulfur down on the cities, completely destroys them, completely wipes them out. The interesting thing, it would appear that archaeology kind of has identified where those cities are today. There is a section in the Dead Sea Valley where there are large sulfur stones. Of a level of purity of that sulfur that is almost unknown in the rest of the world. You can still take them today and light them on fire, and they just burn.
Someone wrote the wheels and chariots in the Red Sea.
Well, you've got that kind of a thing also, yeah, in an arm of the Red Sea that people don't expect. But at any rate, so God wiped those cities out, and so you get the picture, of course, that God has spared Judah, at least so far. They could have become like that. And so there's a faithful remnant. God has preserved for himself not just a people physically, but there are still within Jerusalem some believers, and that is a matter of God's grace. What objection do the Jews seem to raise against the Lord's rebuke in verse 11? Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Listen to the law of our God, you people of Gomorrah. The multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me, says the Lord? I have more than enough of burnt offerings, of rams and of fattened animals. I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. So here we start to get into that section we talked about earlier with God's criticism of the whole worship life. But the way that Isaiah addresses this, what does it seem was the reply? I mentioned a moment ago that when we get offended, when we get confronted with something we've done wrong, our first reaction, we don't react, even as Christians, we don't tend to react out of the new man. We tend to react out of the old man. And the old man says, either I didn't do it or I wasn't wrong. It's the new man who says, I'm sorry. I'm sorry is not something that most people go to right away. They want to maintain a false sense of their dignity by defending themselves. Defend, defend, defend. Never admit your error. That's the human default. And we see it in little kids especially, but you see it in adults just as well. So where did Israel seem to go, or Judah seem to go with this? When God confronted them, they say,
We're following your rules.
are we not showing up at the temple? Are we not bringing a lot of sacrifices? We're bringing you our sheep. We're bringing you our oxen. We keep the feasts. What are you talking about?
But their heart's not in it.
Ah. So it's interesting to hear God say about the very sacrifices he commanded, I've got enough of this. And this is not new with Isaiah. David writes in the Psalms where God says, I don't need a bull from your stall. Cattle on 1,000 hills are mine. It's not as though I eat this stuff. The point of the sacrifices was a communication of the gospel. It was a foreshadowing of the Messiah and his work to the people. In other words, the message, so Israel, you bring the sacrifice, but the point isn't that I get it. The point is that you get a message in this. And they had turned this around. And that is typical of what we might call legalistic worship. The people sit in the pew and they think they're doing God a favor. As though God's taking attendance. Or as though he's going to say, oh, you have an angelic voice. I need to have you sing to me. As though somehow he gets something out of the prayers and the worship. I mean, he wants to be in relationship, and in as much as you're speaking to him from the heart, he loves that. It's part of the reason he created you. But it's not like your worship is a performance. Like you're all on stage and he's in the seats listening to this. That's not the point. And when it came to the sacrifices at the temple, it wasn't, he didn't eat the sacrifices. Literally, he didn't consume them. They weren't for him. You may know that the German word for worship, anybody know what the German word for worship is? Might have heard this. Gottesdienst. Gottesdienst. Anybody know what a dienst is in the servant? So Gottesdienst is God's service. And the idea behind it is trying to say, well, I guess the very fact that it's God's service, it could go two ways, right? Who's serving whom? Is it God's service in the sense that God's getting service from us, or is it God's service in the sense that we are being served by him? Now, there is some of both. But if you're gospel based, you see that the flow is from him to us. The flow is from him to us. You are right to expect to come to worship and expect to get to something out of it. That is entirely a proper demand on your part. And if that's not happening, you can do one or two things. You can either check yourself to make sure you're really paying attention and get what's supposed to be going on, or you can pull your pastor aside and say, hey, something seems to be missing here. But you are right to demand that you get something out of this, because that's why God has you here. And it's primarily flowing from him to us. Go ahead, Robert.
Well, does the minor prophets, some minor prophet said, I despise their sacrifices, and then he also makes a kind of a snarky pass of you cows of Bashan, and insulting the wives of the, and says you
Is it
attack
Amos or
widows.
Hosea? It's one of those two, I think. Don't remember which one, but yes.
But social justice he's getting at, he's saying.
Well, so, and Isaiah's going to go there a little bit here too, isn't he? So yeah, he says, if you want to show that you really worship me, a big part of that then is how you treat your neighbor. What does God need from you? So many of you are leaving offerings probably today or sometime this month. And thank you, it's good for our church. And you've done well. But does God need your offering? Where did you get the money from in the first place? It's like the little kid who takes his allowance, which he received from his parents, to buy a Christmas or a birthday present. And does the parent appreciate that? Absolutely. It's part of training, and it expresses some selflessness on the part of the child. But you recognize that it really came from the parent in the first place. And when it comes to whatever we have, whether it's the offerings of animals that they brought in the temple here, or whether it's our monetary offerings that we bring, God doesn't need to have those on his part, and he can create money out of nothing if he wants to. He could, just like Jesus did with bread and fish, he could make those offering plates out back there just overflow. We get to the end of service and there'd just be a pile of money coming out of there, right? Like it's an ATM. If he wanted to. Don't hold your breath, but if he wanted to, he could do that. He doesn't need what we do. It is on our part an act of worship towards him. It expresses the value that he has in our lives, but it's not that he needs it. But who does need my service? Say it.
My neighbor.
My neighbor. Which is why that not only the minor prophets that Robert mentioned, but Isaiah also goes there with this whole thing. One of the tests that God has of a sincere heart, a heart that really worships him, is going to be, how do you treat your neighbor? It's not just what happens here when you're receiving God's gifts, but it's how you take that out there as you live your life. And so whether that's defending those who are defenseless otherwise, and justice in that sense, whether it is simply a concern for the poor, that we are selfless with the material gifts that God has given us and use them to help other people, whatever form it takes, that my life isn't just about me, that really expresses the changed heart. And this is not something that was new with Jesus when Jesus appeared on the scene. He had a long, many centuries history before him in the prophets to whom he could appeal for that understanding of what real faith looks like. And that applies in the apostles also. The Apostle Paul talks about when he met with the apostles who were the leaders in the church as he was doing his world mission work. And they're kind of hammering, okay, so what do we expect the Gentiles to do and what not that comes from our tradition? And for the most part, it was the moral law. There was a few things that say, well, if you're gonna eat meat with blood in it, that is so repulsive to the Jews, you might take some consideration for your Jewish brother and avoid that. And it's got idolatrous associations aren't so good. But for the most part, the thing was that he got from James and Peter that we have a concern for the poor. That was what Paul was told by them. And he tells the Galatians, which was the very thing we were eager to do. That there would be that kind of a concern for those who had less as they went about living their lives. Verse 10, no, number 10, question 10. Every virtue the Lord looked for in the faithful city, verse 21, had given way to its corresponding vice. What double accusation does of sin does Isaiah bring? So verse 21, he's got a longer list of issues with worship. We just looked at the first verse there. But it's just more examples that he brings. I don't know if anybody else had anything they wanted to point out with that. Not everything in that list, maybe before we go to this question, I'll point out, was commanded. The New Moon Festival wasn't a command. It was a tradition that they had developed, but they had developed some religious practices around marking the new moon. They lived on a lunar calendar. It was necessary for figuring out when Passover was going to... Why are we here today on April 20th for Easter? But last year it was at the end of March. And some years it's...
Because of the lunar calendar and when Passover is.
Okay, so we still mark Easter not on an annual calendar or solar calendar as we usually think of that in our other practice, but we still mark Easter on the lunar calendar of the Jews. And so we celebrate Easter with a similar formula as they had for figuring out Passover. So Easter is the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the first day of spring. That's the formula. First Sunday after the first full moon, after the first day of spring. And that, of course, moves around every year. So it's never going to be earlier than March 20th. It's never going to be... This is about as late as we can go. Right? It's 28... this is about as late as it can go. For Easter, a couple days yet, maybe. Anyway, so the New Moon festivals that they had, that was not commanded by God, but he points them out. So you guys you're all eager to keep these festivals, but what do I care? I mean, with the sacrifices, at least I commanded those. The New Moon festivals, you guys just came up with those yourself. But if they're going to be celebrated with a hypocritical heart, what difference does this make to me? No use. Okay. And on we can go. So now jumping up to verse 21. See how the faithful city has become a harlot. She once was full of justice. Righteousness used to dwell in her, but now murderers. So every virtue the Lord looked for in the faithful city and given to a corresponding vice. What double accusation of sin? At the beginning of the verse, he calls them what?
See how the faithful see. You just said, see how the faithful see. So,
Unfaithful, right? Oh, well, the faithful see what?
became a harlot.
Become a harlot.
Yeah.
Okay. That's not nice words, right? Call someone a whore. That's pretty strong. That's really strong. Now, is he saying that all of them, he isn't necessarily saying that all of them directly indulged in some sort of sexual sin, although this was part and parcel of what did go on. But the fertility religions of the ancient Near East almost all had temple prostitution as a part of them. And so adultery and idolatry are often associated with each other in the Old Testament. The one flows from the other, or the one is a metaphor for the other. So it was a faithful city, like a faithful spouse. Now it's going out selling its body to whomever. And it's as much probably a reference to the idolatry that the nation had dabbled with. And anybody who knows anything about Old Testament history knows that Israel seemed to be in a hurry to worship every god but their own. I think it's in the Psalms, might be later in Isaiah, where God says, every other nation doesn't seem to have any problem just sticking with their God. The Phoenicians, the people up in Tyre and Sidon to north, they worship Baal consistently. Now, they might have been open to other gods, but they stuck with their God. The Ammonites and the Moabites, they worship gods like Moloch. They worship gods like Chemosh, and they weren't looking as a whole nation to switch to some other god. They weren't always looking for something else. But Judah, Israel, it was like they wanted to try all the other gods, and they were in a hurry to get to anyone but the God that had actually revealed himself and had a place in their lives. And so the spiritual idolatry and adultery is a constant thing with which they have to struggle. And open-minded people today sometimes want to say, well, because the Bible teaches there's one God, that it's false logic. That must mean that all gods are the same, right? Because there's just one God. So if the people in India worship some God, and if the people in Africa worship some God, and if the Native Americans worship some God, and if South American tribes worship some God, that must be all the same God.
So is that like universalism?
Well, it can be. Well, yeah, it's kind of a form of universalism. And they'll basically say, well, this people had this name for God, and this people had this name for God. If anyone does not have the Son, they do not have the Father either. That's Jesus' teaching. That's the Apostles' consistent teaching. Paul teaches it. Peter teaches it in his 2 letters. John teaches it in his letters. This is not an isolated New Testament teaching, and frankly, they had a strong feeling for this because it was kind of the main thing that Israel got confronted about in the Old Testament. Baal was not the same as the Lord. Moloch was not the same as the Lord. And they needed to draw that distinction, understand, stay away, be faithful to the God you know, the God who's revealed himself in Jesus Christ. The God who's promised you the Messiah for them. The God of Scripture. The God who sent you these prophets.
It's kind of like those, in a sly way, these coexist bumper stickers that you see everywhere with a Star of David and a cross and a
Oh, the
moon.
coexist?
So they make the words of the C, the O, the X, the E, the C. Yeah, well,
But that idea, right? If they coexist, you can't have one that says this is the true one over the other ones, or you're gonna. In a way, it's kind of a sly.
My question for people who put that bumper sticker on their car is, which one do you follow? And if you don't have any of them for yourself, maybe you don't get an opinion. Now, on the other hand, are Christians about a militant attempt to try to spread our faith? No. Has that happened in Christianity? Yeah, unfortunately. We've got some dark chapters in Christianity where Christians have not been tolerant in the proper sense, right? Faith is a matter of the heart. You cannot force a person to it at sword point or at gunpoint. It has to be sincere. And so you have to understand that as a Christian that you will have to coexist with people who don't share your faith. That much is true. But the implication that somehow it doesn't matter which of these you follow, or they're all the same as each other, that's not right. No. So idolatry was one of them. What's the other one he mentions?
Injustice.
Injustice, yeah. And then his last word is murderers. Okay, so the people no longer were concerned about their neighbor's rights, and instead of my neighbor being someone to love, my neighbor was someone to use. And we should not think that as Christians that's less of a temptation than it is. My neighbor is someone to love. My neighbor is not someone to use. God may have that neighbor there to serve me also. Okay. But that neighbor is there for me to serve and love. Not just an appendage. Not just a tool by which I can get what I want. A very ancient issue that they had going back so far. In the middle of Isaiah's message of judgment, where do you see a clear ray of gospel hope? Jumping to verse 18, I think is probably the best section. Come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they are red as crimson, they shall be like wool. So you have that promise of God's forgiveness in the midst of all this. And it is the strongest gospel section in the entire chapter. The Mighty One declares that he will have vengeance. How does God work his vengeance on his enemies, according to verse 24 and following? So, therefore the Lord Almighty, The mighty one of Israel declares, I will get relief from my foes and avenge myself on my enemies. I will turn my hand against you. I will thoroughly purge away your dross and remove all your impurities. I will restore your judges as in days of old, your counselors as at the beginning. Afterward, you will be called the city of righteousness, the faithful city. So how's God going to get his vengeance?
By judging them.
Who in particular? Or how?
Judah.
All right. So he does. I guess here it's more picture than literal. But turn my hand against you, purge away your dross. Judah is going to have to face some suffering. So you recognize how do you make metal pure?
By heating it up and getting rid of the dross.
Yeah, and how much heat do you need?
It melts.
You know, you're thousands of degrees, right? You're not measuring the degrees, and your kitchen oven isn't going to do the job. The burner on top of your stove isn't going to do your job. The smoker in the backyard isn't going to get the heat you need. We're talking blast furnace kind of heat, which is a hard thing to bear. It's a hard thing to bear, but that is what's God's plan for his people. And so again, although it was going to be difficult for them, you have to recognize that he does this with a heart of genuine love and concern for his people. And it is going to be a purifying thing as they go through these various things. Hey guys, any of you know who Bill Maher is?
Yeah,
M-A-H-E-R. He's got a show on HBO.
late night or something. I don't watch it.
Yeah, well, I don't even have HBO, so I can't watch it. But I see clips sometimes. On YouTube. Mostly he comments on political things. But you know, he's an espoused atheist, and he mocks the God of Scripture as being cruel, and he's had some. Basically, I think he's called the God's Bible, the Bible's God, as a psychopath. The term he's used. What would lead him to such a conclusion? Why would he think God is a psychopath?
I think he started reading the law first.
All right. So God lets his people sit in slavery for a while. God makes them wander in the wilderness for 40 years. God is constantly confronting them with his prophets. God sends them famines. God sends them plagues of various sorts. God sends them into exile again. God lets them be beat up by the nations around them. And when he is delivering them, then he's just beating up on the nations around them. And this seems cruel. And what's with this God? He's a psychopath.
That's true. What do you think about the
The
people?
blast furnace has got to get pretty hot to get the impurities out of the gold and the silver. And so he's not just beating on people for the pleasure of beating on people. I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, he says clearly. But rather that they would turn from their sin and live. And unlike us, who probably have our limits to what we would put another person through in order to save them, God doesn't. And if it will bring you to your salvation, he'll go there. Because he wants you forever and because he loves you. And this we sometimes have struggled to understand, and this the people themselves struggled with as they argued with the prophets at various times. We'll see some of that back and forth with Isaiah later. We're at the end of our time here. I thought we might get through. We got a chunk out. We will pick it up at verse 26 next time. So, thanks.